Okay. All good? Okay. All right, guys. So today we're going to be talking about interpreting evidence as it relates to evolution. Okay, so we've been talking about what evolution is, the mechanisms required for micro and macro evolution, which are different because of the requirement for positive random mutations. And today what we're going to be looking at is evidence. And of course, where else do we hear about evidence other than when we're talking about historical science? Yeah. In a crime scene, right? And it's a great point of reference for us. A courtroom, right? In a courtroom, evidence is admitted, right, by the judge. The judge says this is going to be allowed to be part of the crime the proceedings. And evidence, what is it? It's something material from the past, right? So maybe it's a blood splatter, or maybe it's a gun with fingerprints or something like that. It's evidence from the past. Does it show you exactly who did it? No, right? You have to look at the evidence. You have to use your reasoning and rational mind, and you have to make a judgment, right? We call that an inference. You have to come to a conclusion based on the evidence. Okay, and again, different people come to different conclusions, right? If you look at any court, right, that's why we have 12 jury members, right? You're tried by 12 members of your peers, and all of them have to be in agreement, right? It's a pretty high standard to be found guilty. Anyway, so there's some parallels here, right? We're going to be talking about evidence from the past, so physical things that we can look at that are really old from the past, and based on that evidence, we're not going to prove anything, but we are going to try to understand evolutionary relationships. Okay, and so when we think about evolutionary relationships, we have to think about things that recently diverged. Maybe that would be like on the order of thousands of years, or something that more anciently diverged, which would maybe be something that's hundreds of thousands or millions of years ago. And so those are the sorts of things that we're going to be thinking about here today. So first of all, let's do some underlining and annotating here. There where it says evidence, right? Think courtroom. Right? Evidence are artifacts from the past. So something physical from the past that can be studied to give information about events in the past. Right? So, in our context, we talk about evolution, that's really fossil. So we look at fossils. Evidence is used to support competing beliefs, right? In any trial, you have two different sides, right? The prosecution and the defense, and the prosecution saying, look at this evidence and come to this conclusion. And the defense is saying, look at the same evidence, but look at it this way and come to my conclusion, right? So differences of opinions are allowed, competing beliefs are allowed. Maybe we should incorporate that. Maybe we'll underline competing beliefs. And it's important, if you're a good jury member, it's important to consider all the evidence. Not just the evidence that you're comfortable with, but to consider all evidence. And then make a decision for yourself as to whether you agree or disagree. Evidence can be studied to try to understand how life changed with time. And again, this is that whole idea of evolution, how life changed over time. So when we think about evolutionary approach, the evolutionary approach to looking at fossil evidence, so this again would be maybe the prosecution, look for similarities between different modern day species as evidence of evolutionary relationships. The key word here is similarities. I crossed it out there. Sorry, I meant to underline it. Similarities. It's all about the similarities. Okay, so things that are more similar to each other from an evolutionary framework must be more closely related. Another way of saying it is they diverged more recently. And so if it helps, let's think about it in terms of a phylogenetic tree, okay? Remember, we said this line represents a gene pool. Maybe at this moment in time, there was some isolation that occurred. And maybe at this moment in time, there was some more isolation that occurred. And so maybe we can put time here, right? Okay. And maybe this is species A, species B, species C, okay? What we're saying is that B and C should be more similar to each other than A and C, because B and C more recently diverged than A and C. So maybe we could say B and C are more similar than, let's see, A and C. That makes sense. The more time that's accrued, right, the more opportunity for change to have occurred. Okay. Any questions here? Anybody need more time? Just slip your hand up if you do. All right, great. What we're going to do is something a little bit weird here. We're going to skip over, we're going to be looking at types of evidence. We're going to skip over the first two and go to the third, which is on the second page, okay? Let's go to the third evidence of evolution. Let me raise their hand online. No? Okay, great. Third evidence of evolution, which is fossils. And so fossils, the reason we're going to start with this one is fossils are the only evidence that is actually ancient. Another way of saying this is that it's the only physical evidence from the past. This is all we get, right? And remember, fossils are not animated, right? They don't jump up and move around and show us how they lived and all those things. They are what we sometimes call a snapshot of time, right? All that a fossil actually tells us is that at a particular ancient moment, this organism was alive, right? It doesn't tell us if this organism became the next organism, became the next organism. We can make those connections, we can make those inferences, right? But at any given moment, all we know is that at different moments in time, these different fossils existed. Now, fossils are a challenging thing to study because a fossil has a number of challenges. Fossils only form under certain conditions. So it's not like every animal or plant that died became a fossil, right? The animal has to die basically in an oxygen void environment, no oxygen allowed, so that the body doesn't decompose as quickly, and that the bones will stay intact. Another problem with fossils is they're rarely complete. So if you ever go to the Natural History Museum at the Carnegie Science Center, and if you look closely, you'll see that some of the bones are different colors. They do that on purpose to be honest about the completeness of the fossil. Not all fossils are actually complete. Most are not. It's rare that we get a complete fossil. And so there are parts that are missing. And so sometimes we'll take a fossil over here and a fossil over here, and we'll say, oh, we're missing this piece, but it's in this fossil over here, so let's make a mold of that piece and put it into this fossil over here. Another thing to think about is we don't get a lot of information about the soft tissue. So for instance, we have no idea what color dinosaurs were, right? We look at the cartoons, they're purple, right? Barney. But, we have no idea exactly what color they are. Probably they were camouflaged in some variety. Yeah. That's a great point. So in the case of woolly mammoth, extreme preservation, right, by virtue of being in such a cold environment. Yeah, so I guess there are exceptions. we do get soft tissue. We do have soft tissue, like hair and fur from a woolly mammoth. Yeah. And then, of course, the last one, take all of these together, and it's not a surprise that there are many missing links, right? We don't have a complete fossil record that shows how evolution occurred throughout history. And we shouldn't expect to find one either. It's not going to be one that's found because of many reasons, but one of them being that it's very rare that fossils form. Another problem is you have to go find them, right? And who has time for that? Only a select few individuals or academics that are doing their best, I'm sure, to find fossils and to date them and interpret them. So that's the fossil record. Paleontology, right, is the field that does a lot of interesting work with fossils. We're going to look at two other evidences, but these evidences are a little bit different. Okay? These are what we're going to call modern evidences. And modern evidences aren't really the same as ancient evidences. They're modern, meaning we can look at these things in modern organisms. So things we can look at today. Things that we can look at today to try to understand the past. So to think about, a crime, right, or an evidence or in a courtroom, think about this in terms of looking at the suspects, right? Maybe the suspect is there in the courtroom. Maybe looking at their body language. Do they appear remorseful, right? If they testify, what do they say, right? They were supposedly there at the crime scene. And so we can look at their testimony and their presence as an indication as evidence as well. And so we're going to talk about two categories, anatomy and biomolecular. And again, with both of these, the goal is to look for similarities, right? The more similar two things are, the idea is that they diverge more recently. So let's look at anatomy. First of all, anatomy has to do with the way the body is put together. We have a class here at high school that you could take next year, even if you want to, called Anatomy and Physiology. It's all about how the body is structured and how the body works, how it functions. If you're interested in that. So, homologous structures. We know that word homologous from before when we talked about homologous chromosomes. The idea here is similar but not identical. They're similar things, but they're not exactly the same. And so homologous structure is something that's similar in structure, but not in function. And so if we look at these diagrams of a human arm, a penguin's wing, an alligator's foreleg, and a bat's wing, right? We can see a pattern, right? There's a big bone, followed by, which is represented by the green bone, followed by two skinny parallel bones, the purple and the blue bone. Then we have a bunch of round bones, right, that we call the carpals. Then we have a bunch of bones that in our hand would be in our hand, parallel bones that are long and skinny, followed by a bunch of yellow bones, which are the fingers or the phalanges. And so we can see a pattern there. And so the idea here is that maybe all four of these individuals, all four of these animals, these species, evolved from a common ancestor. Now, they're pretty diverse, right? An alligator is a very different animal than I am. So this would have to be pretty anciently. But this is the idea. Another anatomical feature that we can look at in fossils and in modern day species are vestigial structures. A vestigial structure is a structure that doesn't appear to have a purpose. So, let's see, maybe it doesn't appear to have a purpose anymore. No purpose, I guess. purpose. We'll just have to write that in. No purpose. A vestigial structure, if somebody's describing another person, sometimes you hear this as a vestigial or a relic, right? That's an insult, right? They're saying that they're ancient and you don't have a purpose anymore. So a vestigial is that. And so a classic example of this are whales. If you look closely on some whales, like the right whale, if you look closely, they have hip bones. Of course, they don't have legs, right? They don't have real legs, but they do have what appears to be the ball, or the socket, where limbs would have been at one time. And so that's a vestigial structure. It doesn't do anything for them that we know of. It looks just like, our sockets, but there's no limb that actually attaches to it. Yeah, that's a great question. You can Google those. Some people say things like hair is vestigial. We don't have to have hair to function, right? Some people, the tailbone, that one's a little bit controversial because if you talk to chiropractors and people that are into physical therapy, they say that it's an attachment point for a bunch of ligaments. So, if it was a tail, then it would be a vestigial of a tail. But it also seems to have a purpose. You need a tailbone. If you break your tailbone, you're in trouble. It's going to hurt. So it is something that's important. But Google it. There are all kinds of vestigials. The third one is an analogous structure. And I don't even know why in the Keystone exam they mention the analogous structures as part of the evidence of evolution, but it's really not. So I'm just going to, I felt like I needed to put it in there. This is not an evidence. So maybe they're trying to show what's evidence and not evidence by contrasting. An analogous structure has the same function, but a different structure. So the classic example of this is a bird's wing and a butterfly's wing. A bird's wing and a butterfly wing both allow the organism to fly, but a bird's wing does it a totally different way than a butterfly wing. A bird's wing is, of course, bony, so it has hollow bones that allow the wing to flap. But a butterfly, they don't have any bones in their wings. They have these little tubes that fill up with fluid. And the fluid provides the rigidity needed for the wing to flap. So, do we think birds and butterflies came from a common ancestor? Maybe if we go way, way back, but probably not. Not anything recently. So analogous structures you can think of them as the flipped opposite of homologous structures. Homologous structures would be an evidence, whereas analogous structures would not be an evidence of evolution. Again, I only mention it because it's part of the Keystone exam, and for some reason they include it in the evolution material. Okay, last thing that we can look at, biomolecular evidence. And again, this would be another example of a modern evidence, something that we can look at today and study and try to understand evolutionary relationships. And so the idea is, again, it's all about looking for similarities, but this time we're going to look for similarities not in the structure of the DNA of the arm or body structure. We're going to look for similarities in structure in the DNA itself. And so the idea is if there's similarities in the DNA, that's what's passed down from generation to generation, then that's something that we can look at for evolutionary relationships. One thing that's interesting and noteworthy is the universal genetic code, right? So the DNA language is the same, as far as we know, for all species. So AUG, you guys remember AUG? Jenna said AUG is for August, right? But AUG is also for methionine. It's the start codon.
Or you could say MET.
Or METs, right. That's the case in all species. So
even humans?
In humans, in bacteria, in zebras, in trees, all species have that same code. So some people take that as evidence that perhaps we evolved from a common ancestor. and the language never changed. Another thing we can look at is proteins. We can look for similarities between species in the protein sequence. And so, here in this table, they're talking about the protein called hemoglobin. Hemoglobin is an important protein in our blood. It helps us to carry oxygen through our blood. If you analyze the amino acid sequence in hemoglobin, there are very few differences between a gorilla hemoglobin molecule and a human's. So these are all differences relative to humans. A gorilla's hemoglobin molecule is basically the same as ours, except for one amino acid. A rhesus monkey, again, very similar to ours. If we look at a lamprey, which is kind of a fish-like thing, 125 differences, right? So very different species. We would expect to have very different amino acids. The important thing to consider when we talk about biomolecular evidence is there are some contradictions. And so you have to, again, look at all evidence. And so a great example of a contradiction is cytochrome C, which is an important molecule in cellular respiration. You look at the cytochrome C protein of the rattlesnake and the turtle, they vary in 22 places, but a turtle and a human only vary in 14 places. So by that logic, a human and a turtle would be more evolutionarily similar than the rattlesnake and the turtle, which doesn't seem obvious, right? It doesn't seem like it would be that we've more recently diverged from a common ancestor with turtles. But again, you have to look at all the evidence. So this is just, I'm not trying to convince anybody of anything, but just looking at the evidence and looking at all the evidence, you have to make a decision based on the evidence that's available. Any questions here? Okay, so again, just to summarize, evidences are historical or ancient things that are physical that we can look at from the past. We have to look at evidence just like jury members, and we have to make an interpretation of the evidence. There are different kinds of evidence. There's ancient evidence and there's modern evidence. And modern evidence is information that we can look at today, now. And ancient evidence is evidence that we have to look at in the fossil record and things like that. Okay. All right. Thanks, Mr. Scala. Okay, if you want to turn your cameras back on, you certainly may. Let's go ahead and submit that. Hopefully you've already